Greetings and welcome to this teach-out on tornadoes. This teach-out is one in a series of teach-outs on extreme weather being produced by the Climate and Space Sciences and Engineering Department at the University of Michigan. My name is Perry Sampson. I'm a professor in that department, and today we're going to talk about tornadoes and the great damage they do. Many people carry a fear of tornadoes. Thalassophobia, in fact, is the fear of tornadoes taken to the extreme. Hopefully today will not relieve your fears, but we're going to give you some sense to put in perspective when tornadoes happen, where they happen, so that you'll be more informed about the potential for you to be impacted by a tornado. Now, when we're thinking about tornadoes, the risk of being affected by a tornado has to be put in perspective. And this list you see, for example, that tornadoes are fairly low in terms of the number of Americans who die every year from tornadoes on average. Something like 2 out of 1 million people are affected by dying from tornadoes, whereas other things like tobacco, obesity, and alcohol are far more likely to be a cause of death in America. Nonetheless, we carry with us this huge fear of the tornadoes because they can just seem to pop out of nowhere and can affect almost anybody at any time. We have in America some fear of tornadoes, but even with that small number of weather-related deaths, only 2 in 1 million, tornadoes are even a small part of that. The greatest killer due to weather is going to be heat waves. Tornadoes, maybe something like 10 and 11% of all deaths over the course of a year are coming just from tornadoes. That said, even though the chance of you dying from a tornado is extremely low, nonetheless we all carry in us that fear. And once you've seen a storm like this which is producing a tornado, there are reasons why you should be fearful of the storms. On tornadopaths.org, it allows you to see any tornadoes that are on the ground or have been on the ground for the last 48 hours. And this is constantly being updated on a feed from the National Weather Service. Right now, on this particular day, there have not been any tornadoes in the last 48 hours. What you can do on this site is to see tornadoes today in history. It'll zoom in. Let me just zoom in a bit here on this site. And you can see that on this day, and I happen to be filming this on April 3rd, is a day where there have been many tornadoes in the United States, and including Hawaii, apparently. You can zoom in just a bit here. There we go. And it shows you even the paths on the ground for each tornado on this day. Likewise, you can go to your own zip code, and it will type in the zip code for Ann Arbor, 48104. And it'll show us all the tornadoes that have been in your particular zip code. So it's a way for you just to learn about what storms have happened in your area. And you go click on any one of these storms to see its path and see information about the storm. So get a sense for how often it happens. The big news here is almost anywhere in America there has been a tornado. And there's always that chance that there's going to be a tornado in your area. And so hopefully over the course of this teach-out we will learn how to protect yourself when we do have such an event. On a national scale, the number of tornadoes we expect per year is broken down by state. And you might expect that most tornadoes are happening in Oklahoma and Kansas because they get a fair amount of the press for their tornadoes. The reality is that Texas is the state that has the most tornadoes. Not that their density of tornadoes is that high, but they just have more square miles to deal with, so there are more opportunities for tornadoes to occur in that large state. But if you break it down then into number of tornadoes per square, in this case 10,000 square miles, you see the numbers change, and this is now on a sort of equal basis. The highest numbers, that might surprise you, you might expect it to be Kansas and Oklahoma, but in fact, the most number of tornadoes per square mile happens in Florida. Now, these tornadoes, fortunately, tend to be a little less strong in Florida, last a little less long. So we're going to be focused on those tornadoes that are really strong, can do the most damage. We can look at those maps as well. The chance of seeing an F3 to an F5 tornado is actually quite high, again, high in Kansas and Oklahoma, but even higher in Arkansas and Tennessee. So the spread of where these strong tornadoes can happen is literally around the country. Not so much in the western states, but certainly once you get to the Great Plains and east, you have the risk of an F3 to an F5 tornado. And later in this teach out, we'll talk about what strengths each of these tornadoes brings in terms of wind speed and potential damage. Now, the number of tornadoes per month may surprise you some or not, but the number of maximum tornadoes occurs roughly in the month of May. Now, when we're talking about what causes a tornado, we're going to later find out that part of it's got to do with the heating of the ground, because you know that when the ground gets warmer, there's a greater chance of thunderstorms. But let's back up for a moment. There are thousands and thousands of thunderstorms every year in the United States. Extremely small number of them actually produce tornadoes. And for you to produce a tornadic cloud, you have to have the right set of conditions, which we'll be talking about. But most important here is that it's not occurring when the ground is hottest. That would be in July. We're getting most of these tornadoes in May and April, and there's a reason for that. And that has to do with atmospheric stability. The stability of the atmosphere is really, the best way to describe it is the faster temperature falls with altitude, the less stable the atmosphere is. Let me say that again. The hotter the ground is and the colder the atmosphere is high up, it makes for the air to be less stable. So it turns out that April and May are probably the months that are going to cause the greatest and strongest storms, because the ground is warming up, spring is coming. At the same time, upstairs in the upper atmosphere, they haven't gotten the memo yet, the air is still extremely cold, and so it creates a very strong gradient from the ground into the upper atmosphere. So this is the time, April and May, when these storms are likely to have the greatest frequency. And you can break it down. This is a new chart we've just created of from 1950 up to the present day, the number of tornadoes per day in America. And there's some interesting things going on here. First, you can see the general trend of maximum tornadoes happening in May, but you also see there's some spikiness in this plot. With some days, like the one in the middle of May there, that's May 24th, which is the day apparently where we have, on average, the most tornadoes on that day. Now, why that day, I'm not sure. This just could be random variations. Some years you get these great outbreaks on certain days, like April 3rd. Some years you don't. So there is a spikiness to it, but you see the general curve here with even some spikes out here in November. So we're going to come back and talk about this pattern over the year. But first, let's just focus on the fact that April and May are the months of particular interest. And on top of that, by hour, the number of tornadoes is maximum somewhere around 5 in the afternoon. Now again, when we get into it here, the heating of the ground by the sun is strongest at noon, and yet you know that that's not usually the time of day the ground is warmest. The ground is going to be warmer later in the day because there's a balance between the energy coming from the sun, the ground itself heating up and returning energy into the atmosphere, and the atmosphere returning energy back down to the ground. That balance of energy creates a imbalance in our atmosphere so that it's only about 3 to 5 in the afternoon when we usually hit our highest temperatures. So it's not surprising perhaps that the highest rate of tornadoes is happening at or just after when the temperatures are often highest on the ground. And going further, putting those two together is an interesting plot where you can look at months along this one axis here from January through December, and on the other axis from midnight going to the next midnight here. You can see this peak, so it shows quite strongly that the frequency of tornadoes isn't distributed evenly over all time, and it's very, very much peaked in the late afternoon in April and May and a little bit into June here. And it's quite well defined here that outside of that, the chances of a tornado are actually quite low. So you've narrowed it down then. The tornadoes are likely to happen in the spring months and likely to happen in the late afternoon as your chance of highest probability. And you can see there that here we have May is the red line showing the highest probability occurring at 5 o'clock, which is the yellow line on that graph. Now we can show you how this changes over the course of the year as well. It's that the focus of tornadoes, if I play this through, it starts in January in the south, and as the ground starts to warm up, you see the probability both increases here into Oklahoma and Kansas and moves north then into July, and then the probability of tornadoes drops dramatically and returns back to the south as the year goes on. So this is a pattern we see year after year. The tornadoes start in the south, move up into the central of the Great Plains, hit their peaks there, go further north, and then sort of dissipate. You do get a second peak in tornadoes, usually along the Gulf Coast, which occurs in August, September, and because there are often tornadoes embedded in hurricanes. But that's sort of a secondary event that we won't be focusing on in this teach-out. We're focusing mostly on these storms that occur in the summertime and spring. Of particular note here is that if we look at the number of reported tornadoes since 1950, you can see in this plot that there's a trend. And it would look on first glance like, oh my gosh, there is a remarkable increase in the number of reported tornadoes since 1950. And the logical next question is this related somehow to a warming climate? Well, research has shown that it's probably not, but this is probably more related to an increase in the number of camcorders and people in rural areas and technology, which lets us look inside clouds with radar and actually detect tornadoes that people may never see. So our capacity to actually measure more tornadoes is increasing than the rate of reported tornadoes. We don't really believe at this point that this curve is due to a relationship with any warming of the atmosphere. Later in this teach-out, we will talk about, however, the processes going on in the atmosphere which are related to a warming climate, and think about how they could or could not affect tornadoes in the future. The good news for us is that the number of reported deaths from tornadoes has been on a steady decline. And you can see here with an average running through it that up until the 1930s or so, there are maybe about 2 deaths per million just due to tornadoes in the United States. But somewhere in the 1930s, then the National Weather Service began its process of predicting severe weather, including tornadoes. And their capacity to be able to predict and warn people has had a marked influence and drop in the number of deaths since then. You can see that decline going on more or less steadily since roughly 1930, except there are still some peaks. For example, here in 2011, when we had the Joplin tornado and Tuscaloosa tornadoes, there we had yet another peak. So while the general trend is towards a lower number of deaths due to tornadoes, we still have to be very vigilant about the fact that it is always possible that this tornado will occur, and it's going to occur and go through a populated area, especially as populations are spreading out more into the Great Plains, spreading out across Texas, spreading out across Arkansas, etc. And these new areas of growth are also going to be areas where tornadoes can occur. So should a tornado go through a city like Dallas or Kansas City or Chicago in the future, there could well be another big spike in tornado deaths. All right, up next we're going to talk about tornado outbreaks that have occurred in the past, both in the United States and globally.